Welcome and thanks for tuning in to this year's Intersection of Race and Sports virtual event, presented by Ford and your Mid-South Ford dealers. I'm Michael Wallace of Grind City Media. Traditionally, this event takes place the night before our MLK celebration game at the National Civil Rights Museum. But due to COVID, which has impacted everything across the globe, we've been forced to go virtual. Don't worry, we'll still have a compelling and engaging night of content for you. It includes musical guests that will have remarkable performances. The National Civil Rights Museum is an integral partner in our annual MLK Celebration Weekend. So to tip off our program, please welcome National Civil Rights Museum Chief Marketing and External Affairs Officer, Mrs. Faith Morris.
Hello, I'm Faith Morris. Welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum, and welcome to 2021 and doing things differently. I'm standing in a closed museum because of safety precautions during this pandemic. Usually, as we approach King Day, this museum is full of guests, it's full of families, it's full of kids, and activities all around our campus. Thousands come each year to celebrate this man born king. This year, no crowds, but we're still celebrating. Virtually, though, thanks to COVID. And we're joining the Memphis Grizzlies, as we do each year, in paying tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his life, his legacy. We're continuing the tradition of honoring sports legends and having critical conversations at the intersection of race and sport. Tonight, you'll hear from athletes, journalists, students, educators, and parents. It's our hope that when we share our perspectives and experiences with one another, we can realize understanding and empathy for one another, and further realize the vision of Dr. King.
Thanks, Faith. When it comes to young athletes committed to activism and the journalists committed to telling their stories, there's not a better 1-2 punch in the industry than Grizzlies star power forward Jaren Jackson Jr. and my colleague and friend Marc Spears of ESPN's The Undefeated. Here's their one-on-one conversation.
Well, thanks, Mike. And I think my next guest doesn't need much of an introduction in Memphis. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Marc Spears from ESPN's The Undefeated, and I've had the pleasure of being in Memphis, I think, for the last 3 Martin Luther King weekends to celebrate the weekend and the legacy of Dr. King. And one of the guys I've had the pleasure of getting some time with over the last couple of years and during these events is the one and only Jaren Jackson, Grizzlies superstar and budding NBA star. We just got to get him back on the court. But first of all, man, how you doing, bro?
I'm doing good, man. We're out here in Cleveland. We got a game today, so I'm out here supporting the guys for the game.
Going back to the bubble, the one thing that I think really stood out to me, and I think you respected as a black man, was seeing so many social justice jerseys, seeing players talk about what was going on in the world today, seeing Black Lives Matter on the floor. And I recall that you had VOTE on the back of your jersey. Why did you choose VOTE as your social justice message?
Voting is something that, my ancestors died for. So it was something very important to me and my family. And it was a very relevant topic at the time, we went into the bubble. I thought definitely it was the right message to put out there because I was putting it out there in other ways. Like I was telling a lot of people to vote and, through social media and a lot of other ways, but putting it on my jersey is very visible, very easy to get that message across to younger fans who, even the ones who couldn't vote, to do it when they can, and that it is important.
What did your parents teach you about the importance of voting?
They just, just something you have to do. It's not like a negotiation in my family. It's just something you have to do. It's not something we've talked much about in terms of all the ins and outs why, because at the end of the day, we just think it's a good thing. But if you wanted to get into that type of thing, it's really because of what people went through for this to be a choice. This is how you express yourself. This is how you get things done. This is how you choose leadership, and it's important.
Yeah, I think you guys were gone by then, but when they had the 3-day layoff in the bubble, and they came back, the focus ended up turning to voting. So in a sense, I'm sure you were kind of ahead of the game in terms of where a lot of the focus should be for NBA players. And I'm sure you kind of noticed that from the outside looking in.
I mean, yeah, I've been talking about voting forever. I had voting in my draft suit. So, I mean, I've been talking about voting. I'll always talk about voting. I'll always be one of the first people to talk about it because I think it's so important. And, you know, you can see what that has done for our country now. Like, we're definitely in a much better time now, even though things are still need to change and stuff. We're not as volatile as we once were and self-destructing as we once were.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on, especially with the way voting did have an impact on this election. What were your takes on the events in D.C. last week at the Capitol building?
Definitely speechless at first. Like I didn't really know that was going to happen or anticipate it happening, but it was kind of sad to see. But it is a reflection of what energy has been brought over the past year. So I'm not as surprised when I really thought about it, because this is the kind of stuff that's been bubbling up, and it's been the kind of stuff that's been portrayed out there. And it's been leadership definitely has to step up and be better with that. Like we can't let stuff like that happen. Yeah, it just shows that we have a long way to go, but definitely sad to see. And I'm hoping that, you know, that doesn't continue to happen.
Do you have hope for this country and the younger generation?
Oh, yeah. They'll be the ones to do it. This country won't really get better with our generation or the ones before mine. Like, they kind of lost. We're kind of losing right now. But the kids under us are going to be the ones to really do justice. So I'm just concentrating on teaching them the answer so they can implement it, because you can't really try to change adults' minds that well. It just doesn't work. They've got their own values. They've got their own stuff. They're pretty stubborn unless they, like, you know, have some revelation or go through like enlightenment. They're pretty stubborn. So you got to like tell kids and tell them to just do their research and stay informed, and don't just listen to adults because they tell you it's right. Definitely do your own research. Now a kid's going to get an iPhone at an earlier age. So go ahead and look it up. You guys have the tools.
Unfortunately, you're not going to get to play on MLK Day. What is that game like? How would you describe what it's like to play on that day?
It's a very important day. Just you go out there and give it your all, because you know that it's important. That it's a very visible game for a lot of people who may not have seen basketball, may not have seen you play. Definitely a time for people to get introduced to you. Sorry.
Bless you.
The time for people to get introduced to you. So, you know, put your best foot forward, but know that, like, that's an important day to everybody in America. And, you know, just go out there and play hard. It's very significant, especially in Memphis, where, you know, we have a great museum that's usually packed during that time. And we just have a lot of stuff going around in the city that means a lot.
What have you learned about MLK's legacy since moving to the city, and perhaps some of the things that have like stood out to you from going to the museum? Like, what's your favorite part of the museum?
Probably just my favorite part about the museum in general is just how it flows, like how it doesn't give away everything about MLK's life. It kind of takes you through it piece by piece, so you don't have any judgments. You kind of just see everything in the time he saw it at the time, you know, and how it makes sense. And when you go through like that, a lot of the things he did make sense. I know that there was like people wanted him to be more like Malcolm X at a time and just be very straightforward and out there about it, where Malcolm X was more of a, you know, let's just take everything down kind of attitude. Martin Luther King was patience and perseverance and doing the little things and helping thy neighbor and stuff like that, which is very significant. And I think both have positives for sure. But it's nice to see somebody who stuck to that, even though probably was told from everybody that an explosive option was another way, and he just stayed strong and didn't do it.
Yeah. switching to basketball, man, because I know a lot of Grizzlies fans are curious. How are you doing mentally and physically right now?
I'm good. I've been good. I knew going into this process that it was going to take a little bit. I was never, definitely had probably a day where I was just mad about it, but I mean, definitely not now. I have a lot better perspective over the whole thing, and I'm young. I got to just make sure everything's right because I don't want to be having these problems like later. So I'm just taking the time now to make sure my body's good, my knee's good, I'm healthy. But no, everything's been moving smoothly though. Like if anybody cares,
They care.
Everything's been moving smoothly at the pace that like we thought and I thought it would be. And yeah, it's been great. If anything, it's been better than how we thought. So yeah, I'll be back. I'll be back this year. Who knows when, but it won't be too long, but I'll be back this year for sure.
What was your toughest day and biggest triumph through all this time?
Probably just watching my team lose in the bubble from home because I had to leave and go get surgery, and I came back home and we were playing Portland, and that was our last game, and I remember watching that just sick that I couldn't participate in it and really wanted to help them any way I could because I just knew I could. And yeah, that was probably the hardest day. Then it just became summer, and then it was the grind. I was in the gym every day working on rehab, and I mean, I've been in there every day since. Literally, I never left. Like I've just been grinding, and anywhere I went, I just was doing something with my trainer or whatever. Literally, it's just been a lot. I'm thinking about probably everything right now, and I'm glad I've been taking the route I've taken.
So no timetable at the moment?
Nothing I'm about to tell you, but definitely have.
I thought we were boys, man.
Nah, we're boys, just not everybody. So, but no, I have a timetable. It's not that far, believe me. It'll probably sneak up on you, but it's something that, remains to be seen.
What has this time off the court been like with Ja? I know you guys can't wait to get back on together, but you probably weren't expecting to have all these clothed conversations, but
I mean,
in jerseys, not in sweats and stuff.
I mean, it isn't that much different because we talk like all the time, regardless like who's playing, who's not. Like, I mean, we're always talking. But I think when he went out, I was like, wow, like I was a horrible day, like for me at least. I didn't. I mean, definitely for him, but like I was sick for him. Like I didn't really feel like talking to nobody. Like I was just even after the game, and we won that game, so I was just like sick for him. But no, he's taking it like a champion. He'll be back sooner than me, so he'll be back running, doing all his stuff. He looks great right now. But yeah, he is we have good attitudes about it, man. We trust in the process, trust in God, all that. We're not thinking too hard about anything. We feel the love from everybody around us, like wanting us to get back. Like I feel it for sure. Like I know how everybody feels. Trust me, as much joy as they feel, I feel it. As much frustration, I feel it too. So you just take it all. It's kind of fun. I mean, we are living out our dreams here. We're just going through it.
A couple more questions, and I'll let you go. So there was a report that you grew. Is that true?
Yeah, I grew.
So how tall are you now?
7 feet.
How is that gonna affect your game anyway?
I just got to be a 7-footer now, man. Like, do 7-foot stuff, duck under doors, and try to like touch the rim without jumping, and just be a 7-footer. There's a bunch of 7-foot bucket list of things I got to check off. Like being in Walmart and getting paper towels for ladies.
You were doing that already.
For sure. I got to just use that as my pickup line, though. Like, I can go at home or something.
You'd be very helpful in Home Depot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lastly, or actually two more things. The state of the Grizzlies. For a fan bummed out about you and Ja being out and worried about this season, what do you have to tell them?
I mean, it's very easy. Like, it's funny when people tell you to have patience and just breathe and know that things turn around. Like, that is very true. And I'm not going to tell anybody that it's easy to have like patience or anything like that. It's going to suck. Like, trust me, it sucks sometimes. But everything does turn around if you just let it. Like, you can't force the issue. You can either choose to be in agony over the time that, you know, we're not on the court, or you don't like something that's going on at home in your life or whatever. It doesn't really matter the situation. It could apply to this or apply to something else. But if you just try to like have a good attitude through it and understand everything and take everything for what it is, then you'll be fine. Like, it's not easy to do that though. So I'm not giving nobody like the easy answer here. I'm just telling people what the right answer is.
And lastly, in Memphis, what does this weekend, this celebration mean? What have you learned about MLK Weekend since arriving in Memphis? It's special to you.
I just love how it brings the whole city together. It brought the city more together than I thought. I didn't know. I was just, when I first saw it, when I first started doing it, it was like just joy. When we could have fans at the game, it was packed. It's like people tailgating, almost like it. People go through in the morning, they'll wake up, be with their families. We'll do a lot of learning in that morning, like go to the museum, talk to different people. Celebrities are coming through. They're definitely around. So people are trying to do meet and greets and stuff like that. And then after that, people are just, you know, having fun. Adults are drinking, kids are running, and then they just all come to the game. And then it's just one big, like, you know, no matter how the game goes, we're just all here on this day. And it's a collective thing. So that's really where the joy comes.
Well, Jaren, man, I look forward to seeing you on the court.
For sure.
I look forward to a healthier day where I could go to the court and shake your hand. And, man, continued success, brother.
Yeah. We'll be back soon. Always soon, man. Just keep saying soon.
All right.
Jaren is already making as big of an impact off the floor as he is on it. This season, the Grizzlies launched the Memphis Soul City Edition Nike uniforms that they'll wear throughout the 2021 NBA season. Rich in music history, Memphis is birthplace to one of the most legendary recording studios, and the City Edition uniforms pay homage to the legacy of Stax Records. Now performing from Royal Studios in South Memphis, here's Stax artist Larry Dodson, former lead singer of the Barcades, backed by the High Rhythm Section.
Good evening, Memphis. Go Grizzlies. I don't want to lose this good thing that I got. If I do, I would surely lose a lot. 'Cause your love said it's better. That any love I know is like thunder, lightning. The way you love me is frightening. I've never knocked on wood. Come on, baby, I like that. Feeling good. Wow. No secrets from that woman. She's my loving cup, and she sees to it that I give enough. Just one touch from her, you know it means so much. It's like thunder, lightning. The way you love me is frightening. I've never knocked on wood. Come on, baby, baby. Think I've never knocked on wood. Think I've never knocked. Oh yeah. Think I've never knocked on wood. Think I've never knocked. Oh, I'm feeling that. Chris, let's take a way back. very same day. Don't you ever be sad. Lean on me when times are bad. When the day comes and you're down in the river of trouble and about to drown. Hold on, I'm coming. Hold on, I'm coming. I'm on my way, your lover. And if you get cold, yeah, I will be your cover. Don't have to worry, 'cause I'm here. Don't need a suffer, baby, 'cause I'm here. Hold on, I'm coming. Hold on, I'm coming. Hold on, I'm coming. Hold on, I'm coming. Reach out to me for satisfaction, yeah. Call my name, Larry, for quick reaction, yeah, 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 the hard way. All you got to do, just hold on. I'm coming. Hold on. And I'm coming. Just hold on. I'm coming. Hold on. I'm coming. Just hold on. I'm coming. Hold on. Just hold on. I'm coming. Hold on. Wow.
Now we'll hear from NBA legends Grant Hill, Elliot Perry, and Jalen Rose. Moderating the conversation is President of the National Civil Rights Museum, Terri Lee Freeman. But before we get to Terri, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Terri for guiding the museum that turns Memphis's deepest tragedy into its most powerful lessons. Terri is leaving the museum in February to take a position in Baltimore. The Grizzlies will miss her invaluable contributions to this annual celebration, and we wish her all the best. Here's Terri.
Thanks for the kind words, Mike. I've enjoyed this annual partnership and the support of the Grizzlies organization throughout my time at the museum. Martin Luther King Day, the anniversary of the birth of Reverend Martin Luther King, is an opportunity for us as a nation to reflect on issues of social justice, to celebrate how far we've come from our troubled past, to plan how we will move from here and to even more an equitable place, and to take note of the opportunities we all have to make a positive difference here in this moment. Last year, this forum was used to discuss historically Black colleges and universities and the student-athlete experience. While we will touch on the topic of education today, we'll be having a larger discussion about the year that was 2020 and all that it brought to us in the way of social justice, social injustice, a global pandemic, and our collective response to both of those things. So today we're joined by a panel of celebrity athletes who are not just talking about these issues, they're taking action. So let's meet our panel. Joining us this evening is Grant Hill. Grant enjoyed a celebrated 18-year NBA career that featured 7 NBA All-Star appearances and 1 selection to the All-NBA First Team in 1997. Hill also received the Rich and Helen DeVos Community Enrichment Award for his work in the Central Florida community as a member of the Orlando Magic and was a National Civil Rights Museum Sports Legacy recipient in 2017. Welcome, Grant. Next is Elliot Perry. Elliot played 10 seasons in the NBA. including 2 games for his hometown Memphis Grizzlies in his final season. His current credentials with the Grizzlies include Director of Player Support, Limited Partner of the Grizzlies Ownership Group, analyst on the team's radio broadcast, and chairman of the Grizzlies Foundation Board. He also serves on the board of the National Civil Rights Museum and Teach for America. Good to see you, Elliot. And lastly is Jalen Rose. Jalen, currently an ESPN analyst, 13-year NBA veteran, and member of Michigan's Fab Five. He has established the Jalen Rose Foundation and charitable fund that creates opportunity for underprivileged youth, as well as the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy in his hometown of Detroit. Jalen was a National Civil Rights Museum Sports Legacy recipient in 2016. Good to see you, Jalen, and thanks for being with us today. So let's go ahead and get started with this conversation about the year that was 2020. It truly was the year that kind of just kept on giving. Not the type of gift that we want to get. And in fact, it gave us so much that it gave us 2021. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's start in 2020. You know, the year started with the very tragic deaths of Kobe Bryant and his daughter, Gianna. It was a moment when most people really felt like they had been gut punched. It was just tragic, tragic news. And on the heels of that awful news was this whole growing concern about this novel virus, this coronavirus that was sweeping across the world. We now know it as COVID-19. It's an unseen enemy that has changed the way we live, as well as having taken far too many lives across the globe, and particularly here in the States. And unfortunately, the majority of those lives are people who are Black and brown people. One of the biggest changes for us, though, in the wake of all of these changes in 2020 was the really swift halt to all athletics and sporting events. I'm sure most people know where they were when they started hearing that things were not going to continue. When sporting events did resume, however, the NBA made the decision to create an impenetrable bubble to complete the season, and it worked. No other professional sport was able to say that they had no cases of COVID when they resumed their season play. So I want to first congratulate the NBA and thank the NBA for caring enough about the players and their fans to protect them. So let's begin this discussion with your thoughts on that, about the NBA's response to COVID-19 in 2020 and how this virus has changed life for athletes in general and the game of basketball specifically. And Grant, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, you know, I think when you go back to early March 11th, that was a Wednesday night, and Rudy Gobert from the Utah Jazz tested positive. And at that point, we were starting to hear about COVID. Obviously, we knew that it was prevalent over in the Far East. And but there still was just a lot of uncertainty about it, what kind of impact and effect it would have, not just on sports, but with just our society and how we operate in general. And at that time, when really there was an absence and a void of leadership at a federal level, you know, I do have to applaud Adam Silver and the NBA for providing leadership in a time of crisis. And certainly, you know, I think them taking a stance and, you know, causing a halt to the remainder of the season really, I think, emphasized the severity of this pandemic. And as you saw afterwards, a lot of folks started to follow suit. And I think at that point, we realized that there was a real issue here and a real sense of urgency. But the NBA, you know, listened to the scientists, the medical experts, and ultimately somehow, some way figured out a way to, you know, to safely conclude business. And you know, I also want to be mindful of mentioning not just Adam Silver, but Michelle Roberts and Chris Paul, because it was a collective effort to come up with this idea of the bubble and really to be able to execute in some ways flawlessly. You know, gave one of the things that I appreciated was that they gave, you know, players, coaches, people with the option of not working without, you know, with no repercussion. And you can contrast that with, you know, with the meat packers and some of the essential workers who ultimately were fired if they chose not to work. They implemented testing, contact tracing. Obviously, it was a strain on players, on coaches, on staffs, and being away from family. So I don't want to say it was perfect. But, it could have ultimately been a model for the rest of our country to follow. You look at some of the countries like New Zealand and South Korea. They got to a point where they're able to control the virus. We haven't done that. But, I do think being a part, as all of us are, part of this sort of NBA family, there's a sense of pride knowing that, our leadership did the right thing at a real difficult time and was able to resume, NBA basketball and provide that for our fans and for our customers.
And I think that was so important because people were at that point, we needed something. We needed something that was going to help us get through what we didn't even know we had to get through, to tell you the truth. Elliot or Jalen, do you have anything to add with regard to the NBA's actions around COVID?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I will say that I agree with Grant in terms of the leadership piece, but also thinking about solutions. I mean, we knew what the problem was, but a lot of people didn't know how to really deal with the problem. I think Adam Silver, he talked about Michelle Roberts, Chris Paul, and that leadership thought about solutions. And a lot of times in a time of need, we always think about the problems, but we don't think about the solutions. And the league was able to execute on those solutions.
And I'll take it into the bubble. One of the things that Adam Silver and his leadership did an amazing job of working with the Players Association, Michelle Roberts and Chris Paul as well, was agreeing with the players that while social injustice was taking place throughout our country, that the league was going to take an unprecedented step and put Black Lives Matter on the floor. And 29 messages of social statements on the back of uniforms. That was something that was really needed, not only for the NBA, but clearly needed for society. As a player like LeBron James helped usher in more than a vote. The WNBA players did an amazing job of letting their voices be heard. And you saw how that foundation of the NBA and our players and the WNBA players really made a change throughout our country.
Yes. And that's one thing that we've talked about for a couple of years, is that the NBA and the WNBA have been really proactive when it comes to these issues. So this conversation has been titled The Intersection of Race and Sport. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what you just brought up, Jalen. 2020, really shone a spotlight on policing and the criminal legal system that too often victimizes Black and brown people. On May 25th, 2020, I'm sure it's a date we will never, ever forget, we watched a Minneapolis police officer apply deadly force with his knee on the neck of Mr. George Floyd. This videotaped murder followed the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. It also occurred within 7 days of a white woman in New York Central Park knowingly making a false charge against a bird-watching Black man. There was a collective kind of human response to this series of events that has been called a racial reckoning. And as you mentioned, Jalen, the NBA and its players were truly in the middle of it. So let's talk a little bit more about the players and that response. Elliot, what do you think drives the NBA to be so willing to make sure that the players are involved in these issues?
I think it goes back to what I said before. It goes back to leadership. I think it shows that the league and Adam Silver was willing to partner with this player, look at this dictatorship. And that's important, that the players know that they have a voice, that the players know that they have a safe space to really talk about the issues, because this is nothing new. We've seen players, back in the day talk about some of these issues, but not all players felt like they had a voice to talk about these issues. And I think given that safe space that the league, the Players Association, all of them have given our players, it made a tremendous difference, and it made a tremendous impact in terms of using their platform to talk about these social injustices.
Grant, what do you think is the overall impact of the NBA players demonstrating that show of solidarity?
I mean, I think it's a huge impact. And, I'm a history major, and, I'm mindful that when you go back to ancient civilizations and you go back to the ancient Greeks, they understood back then the value and the power of sport. And they would, in years of Olympics, would actually halt wars to put on Olympic Games. And I think, the power of that was they understood that sport speaks to us and it inspires, and there's something about it that speaks to everyone. And so as you fast forward, throughout the years and obviously the present day, that's only magnified. Mm-hmm. And so when you have, athletes who are essentially, icons and global figures, the game of basketball, the NBA, it's a global business, a global brand. And you're out here and you have folks who are speaking out and speaking out against injustices. That's powerful. But, I do think, and Jalen talked about, sort of the willingness to do something and be innovative during the bubble and allowing players to put messages on their backs, using the bubble as a platform during the restart last summer. But to me, it's a continuation of a tradition, and, Elliot talked about former players, Bill Russell, who, gets lost in the GOAT conversation, the winningest basketball player ever. Oscar Robertson, Kareem. I mean, they established that tradition. We've had progressive leaders, David Stern, Adam Silver, many players through the years. Some sports talk about the lack of black coaches in their sport. Well, the NBA, Bill Russell was the first black coach, won a championship. Casey Jones, Lenny Wilkins was, at one point, the winningest winningest coach in the NBA. I'm not saying it's perfect. And certainly I think, as great and as progressive as our league is and our players, there's still room for improvement. But I think this is a continuation of, I think of some of our more successful modern coaches, white coaches, Greg Popovich, Steve Kerr. They've been very outspoken throughout all this. So I think for all of us, there's a sense of pride, knowing that we're part of a community that cares and understands its value, understands its voice, and is not afraid to exercise it.
And I'm sure that the NBA would speak out regardless of if it were a black person who's being, held down by a police officer or a white person. The fact of the matter, though, is that the majority of NBA players look very similar to Mr. George Floyd. And the majority of WNBA players look very much like Breonna Taylor. So it is so important to the black community that our icons do demonstrate some civil disobedience in a lot of ways around these issues. So that occurred in the spring and the summer, and there was a lot of, action going on in our communities. There were protests literally in every state in the union. There were protests in most countries. And we got to 2021, and we flipped the calendar page, and things seemed to look pretty much the same as they did in 2020. As it related to COVID, we are in a worse place than we were in the spring and summer. And some might say that with regard to social justice and any change that we can see, we're in probably the same place or a worse place, given that recently we saw that no charges would be brought against the police officer who shot Jacob Blake 7 times in the back in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We got the verdict, if you will, even though it wasn't a verdict, because no one was charged for the murder of Breonna Taylor. And then just a few days ago, we had a riot of a group of thugs that actually stormed and breached our nation's capital. And the majority of those thugs didn't look like you and me. They looked like white men. So I'm going to just ask the question because we can't not talk about this. What do you all think would have happened had it looked like this group that's on this screen trying to, and I say trying to because I'm not convinced we would have gotten very far, but trying to storm the Capitol? Anybody can answer.
I think that we know what would have happened. I'm sorry, Jalen. I just think that we know what would have happened. I mean, I don't think that this is an issue. We know that there's a clear difference between the way they were treated and the way Black Lives Matter protesters were treated. And so I think that we just have to, make sure that, I think one thing that it did, particularly for me, is it uncovered the veil. There was a veil before, then over the years throughout the civil rights movement, all those things, we tried to chip away at that veil. I think the other day at the Capitol building, it completely took away the veil and showed what America is really like, that there is two Americas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jalen?
Wow. What happened the other day in Washington, what would have happened to this? We would have like that. Fortunately, in America, we've seen that take place over 400 plus years. And while they were actually protesting, I guess, some progress that has been made politically, I think where we can't lose sight of the fact, as you mentioned, it was not a diverse audience at all. And basically being ushered by law enforcement, basically encouraged in a lot of ways to denounce a fair democracy that took place, and it just so happened that their candidate lost. And so they have the white privilege to believe that they can now go to Washington, D.C. and overthrow the government, because this is what they have been able to do respectfully when they disagree with things that have been happening as it relates to progress for Black and brown people and for immigrants. Mm-hmm. And the progress that we saw is that those people felt like their America is slipping away from them. You know why? Because it is. And I like to compare to football. You appreciate this, Grant. It's like field position. We're not going to necessarily win the game. The score of this game is 400 years of slavery to 0. So it's the first quarter. We know we're not going to win in our lifetime, but we still got to get out there and play as hard as we can for the shoulders that we stand on. And I heard Bill Russell brought up earlier. Remember, the most important picture in the history of sports was the Ali Summit. It's Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, and 2 basketball players, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bill Russell. It's important for us to be voices in our community, because what happens is the people that tell us to stick to sports or shut up and dribble, they know the power that we have. So it matters when the Atlanta Hawks open up their polling site and the Detroit Pistons do, and the Milwaukee Bucks decide not to play because of what happened to Jacob Blake. That matters in Wisconsin. We saw what happened in the races in Georgia. The WNBA players for the Dream, they helped flip the election. So now the people who are protesting in Washington are upset because they realize finally that our vote does matter. Because for so many years in our community, we felt like the candidate doesn't look like us, the candidate isn't speaking to us, right. So a large portion of our community wasn't voting. I heard the NBA players in the bubble say 25% of the players had never voted. And these are professional players making millions of dollars. It wasn't that they're not aware or educated to what's happening, it's that they felt their voice and their vote didn't matter. Exactly. And so I'm really appalled by what I saw happening in Washington a couple of days ago, but we know how we would have been treated if we were scaling the side of the White House, because we have images of us being sicked on by dogs, being sprayed with water hoses, being shot with with rubber bullets. We know those images. And when we saw that did not happen for people that didn't look like us, it justified it for everyone else that was in the
And those images of us with those water hoses and those dogs were us protesting for rights that our Constitution says we actually have, but we weren't being given. I don't even like to call the folks that were in Washington protesters, because the whole premise was, frankly, fraudulent. And you're absolutely right. There's no way we wouldn't have gotten to the point of scaling a wall. That just wouldn't have happened. Grant, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, those folks in D.C., they claimed to be patriots. They were terrorists. That was an act of terror. And as Jalen and Elliot both talked about, we all know what would have happened. We as Black folks, we're bold, but we ain't that bold. We know what would have happened in that situation, no doubt. But to continue with what both EP and Jalen talked about, 2020, it was really interesting. You have the symbolism of 2020, and that's perfect vision.
Right.
You go to the doctor, you have 2020 vision, you have perfect vision. And it took a global pandemic for the whole world to come to a halt, where all of a sudden nothing's happening. We're sitting at home and we're all watching Jalen on TV, talk about sports. But really, I mean, there's nothing going on at all. And then there's a series of events that you alluded to that occurred. And as Elliot said, it definitely, you got a chance to sort of, look behind the veil, and we're no longer in this unconscious state. We're no longer in denial. We have to sort of address and deal with what's happening. Now, we all know all of these things have been happening for many, many years. And players and, current players in the NBA have been speaking out on these injustices for a while. But now it took everybody coming to a standstill, and they were forced to watch and forced to deal with what Jalen talked about, privilege. That woman who was in Central Park, and when she threatened to call the police and did call the police, she was a liberal. She voted for Obama. She probably had some Black friends, but she knew the power in that threat, and she knew that's a dangerous thing right there. And subconsciously, it's ingrained and it was ingrained in her. I would assume. I'm making assumptions here, and so. But bringing this out to the light, as horrific as this summer was, putting a spotlight on it, putting a spotlight on what happened at the Capitol. We got people now who are seeing this behavior, and they're saying, "Is this really who we are? This is who we voted for." I'm part of the 70. I'm not saying literally me, but these people are part of the 75 million who voted for this particular man, and this is what he like. And so, much like the civil rights movement, where television played a role, and you have pictures and images, the very things you talked about, we're seeing that now. We're seeing it with phones. We're all now part of the media because we have the power to upload and put out these atrocities to the world. And so, the civil rights movement was not done, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but the civil rights movement, sometimes we think about the March on Washington, we think about, the Birmingham bus boycott, and we think about their acts in isolation, but it was over years. It's a continuum, and it's still ongoing. And so, as Jalen said, we owe it to our parents, to our ancestors, to those that came before us. We may never get to the point we want to get to. We may never get to, but we got to keep moving the needle forward. We got to keep fighting the good fight. And we owe it, like as Jalen said, we're standing on other people's shoulders who gave us the opportunity to be in the situations that we're in right now.
And I want to give a nod to young people, because it was the young folks who came out and said, we're not going to watch this stuff go on. We're not going to allow you to continue to put your knee on our neck, literally and figuratively. And what we know historically is that no movement ever started with anybody over 35. So we have to depend on young people to move this forward. And I think it'll be really interesting to see where we move from this moment, given what we did see at the Capitol, because each of us weren't surprised about what we saw happen. We knew that this could potentially happen, but it was surprising for many people. So it'll be interesting to see where we go from here. And I think that we are going to have to stay very aware and keep our eyes and ears open so that we're moving in the right direction and we don't get lulled into a place of complacency. And if 2021 is anything like 2020, we won't be able to get lulled into complacency. Let me jump back a little bit, back to COVID, because I talked about its impact on athletics, but one of the areas that it has had a huge impact is education. And it's something that I'm frankly very concerned about. Schools pretty much shut down immediately in March and went to remote learning from K-12 up through college. And we've learned that it's had a really negative impact. The remote learning just doesn't work for everybody. And young people who are in families that have some means have the ability to hire tutors. Young people who have families who have some means may have people who are around them being able to be online with them while they're doing this remote learning. But it has had a significant impact on children who some don't even have really active Wi-Fi, being able to utilize the technology that we're trying to employ to help educate people. So I know that education is something that's very important to the NBA, and I'm curious about your thoughts on where we are with education for young people in this environment and how you think we might be able to move forward to help these young people who have really taken it hard with regard to being able to have what we think as a normal classroom. Grant, why don't you talk a little bit about that if you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us, all of us here on this panel. I mean, like you said, we're in a great position, in terms of what we've been able to do with our lives and providing, great education for our children and our family, and so we're blessed for that. I do think. I mean, I think about. I have a daughter who's in college, and I think about my 13-year-old middle school age, and sort of going through this COVID environment with them. And it's been as much as we can provide for them, it's been a challenge. And, on one hand, I believe kids are resilient, maybe more resilient than adults in a lot of ways. But how do I say? Okay, so like when a baby is born to a crack addict, they cry uncontrollably and they're naturally uncomfortable. And what we've learned over time is that hugs and connection to other human beings help. And I think ultimately we are social beings, and we're meant to connect and interact with each other in person. We know that collaborative learning and socialization, being a part of a group, is how we learn best, is how we operate best. And so, we're trying our best with technology. We're doing our best here with this, virtually having this panel discussion. Right. But with young people who are impressionable, who are learning, the fact that computers aren't available to all kids, and disproportionately, most of them are Black. We have to change that. And especially, we have to change that even when we get out of this COVID environment. When we get back to what we call normal, we have to recognize and understand that. So, I also think, I think of Jalen and certainly what he's done. He's been passionate and committed and has poured money and resources into his school and promoting education in his hometown. And that might be for another discussion, but we need a renewed interest in education. But look, I'm not an education expert. I'm not a therapist, but, I do think that we're all trying to learn how to survive without interaction and connectivity. But I think most importantly, the kids, young people who are in school, whether they come from means or not, they're the ones that are really missing out because that's part of the educational experience where they learn best.
Jalen, talk a little bit about education now in 2020 and the difficulties that we're seeing.
There was once a political candidate who was asked, why is he not going to stomp in Michigan, in particular in Detroit? And he said, when states get sick, Detroit gets the flu. And that always stuck with me. And it gave me a renewed sense of I could try to do more to influence the young people in my hometown. And so now, 10 years in of the Jalen Rose Leadership Academy, and we're a 9 through 16 model, which means we influence 400 young people that are currently in high school and another 600 young people that are in post-secondary education. That's college or university, that's community college, that's trade school. So currently, we influence around 1,000 young people. And the biggest thing, remote learning, the biggest challenge of remote learning that I've noticed is that, and Grant alluded to it, and you guys are doing an amazing job. I'm happy to be here with you guys. Is that my personal kids like Grant. I have a daughter that's a junior at the University of Georgia, and I have another daughter that goes to private school, and she's in 9th grade. And you would think as a parent that they're going to turn in 100% of their homework because they're at home. So, you have everything set up. You got the computer, you got the signal, mom making breakfast, like whatever you need, like 100% of the things should be turned in. And then you see with your own kids that's not happening, right? And so the scholars that I deal with at JRLA, the sad thing that became a reality to me is that leaving your home and your community for 8 a.m. to like 5 p.m. And if you play sports like we all did, that becomes later in the evening. That actually becomes your safe haven. You're safer in a lot of ways away from home and away from your community because it gives you an opportunity to grow, learn, and interact with people that don't live in your house, that don't live on your block, and may not necessarily think or feel like you think and feel, but they look like you. And so I want to give a big shout to the NBA, in particular the Detroit Pistons, because as this pandemic hit and we started to remote learning, Arn Allen helped provide computers, along with his wife Nancy, for the scholars at JRLA, because that was one of our major needs. Anybody that's purchased a computer recently, you understand, like that technology turns over really every couple of years.
Right.
So we're paying for our iPhone today, we're paying for our computer or whatever today, but in 2 or 3 years, that technology turns over. And so that's a major challenge socially, that they're not there to interact with each other and even play sports. It's one thing when we watch professional sports and there's no people in the stands, but imagine as high school young people having that interrupted in one way, shape, or form, which also becomes an escape. So it's been really challenging, but I want to give all of the young people a lot of props, not only as mentioned earlier in the call for getting out, being voting, being game-changing agents, but trying to stay focused and learn via computer during this pandemic.
Yeah. Elliot, do you worry about the learning loss that's taking place right now and how kids are able to handle this? And I think Jalen made a good comment about just the loss of high school athletics, college athletics, in many different types of college athletics. Do you worry about that?
Yeah, I think you all worry about it, but I think that both Grant and Jalen made good points in terms of the learning loss. And I think that we're going to have to get creative about the learning loss. Just like the NBA got creative about getting people back on the court, we're going to have to get creative about that. The digital divide is something that's serious. I mean, kids that don't have computers, that don't have internet, you alluded to some of those things. But I want to read something that and these numbers may not be completely updated, but I want to read something from the ACLU that I think is even more important as we go forward as it relates to education. It said 1.7 million students are in schools with cops, but no counselors. 3 million students are in schools with cops, but no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with cops, but no psychologists. 10 million students are in schools with cops, but no social workers. And as much baggage that our kids bring to school sometimes, and I agree with Jalen that sometimes being in that space from 8 to 5 or 8 to 4 is a safe space for students. But I think we're going to have to deal with not just the learning loss, but some of the psychological things that having not being in school is going to provide for our students. And so I think that we're going to have to deal with this thing in a number of different ways. And it's going to be interesting. It's going to take some significant leadership and some people to make some tough decisions about the learning loss and be creative about how do we regain some and recoup some of that learning loss. And maybe it's extended year, next year.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we shouldn't do is just depend on the government to be there to figure this whole thing out around schools. While I'm hopeful that we will have more investment, particularly in public school systems, I think that it's going to be up to us, as you all have said. It's going to be up to us to kind of figure out what is it that we have to do as citizens to help our young people, because they can't get these years. They can't get March 2020 through June 2021 back. Though that time is gone. So how are we going to help them? Elliot?
Well, I will say this is that, I mentor every week at Grizzlies Prep, and that's Grizzlies Prep is an all boys school, five to it's a middle school, 5th through 8th grade that the Grizzlies have funded. And I think a lot of it has to do with mentoring, to be honest with you, that we all have experiences, we all have opportunity to really pour into young people, and how we pour into young people is going to be important. Are we giving them the confidence? Are we giving them the confidence in themselves that they can do anything? Are we encouraging them in times of need? Are we listening to them? Because I think they bring a lot of equity to the table as well. And so I would encourage all of us to, think about mentoring programs that really work, partnering with organizations that run mentoring programs. We have a model with the Grizzlies Foundation, a 3 to 6 model that I participate in, where we put 3 adults with 6 kids, and we meet every week. And it's astounding, some of the things that I learn about young people. I try to be vulnerable with our young people, because I let them know that if I'm only just a basketball player and I'm only just a sports figure, I failed. And to give them the safe space to say, hey, anything you want to do, it's possible. But I think you have to embrace that process. And the more that we can continue to push them out of their comfort zones to embrace those processes, the more we can expose them, not just to things, but to people as well. The more they can see what they can be, all those things are possible. And so I think that's an avenue we can go down.
Yeah, I think that COVID certainly has been a harsh teacher in a lot of ways with regard to what, frankly, isolation can do to populations. And we've talked about education learning loss. We've talked about, families of means and the challenges even those families have with kids learning remotely. But we also know that schools are places, as you all have said, are safe havens. And they're also places where kids get meals. And the issue around food that have presented themselves for not just the kids, but families who have been so dramatically impacted by this pandemic from an economic perspective. I want to ask you one more question that kind of touches on this issue of the economics that we're seeing with COVID. Do you think that we will, as a society in general, be more appreciative of people that we are now calling essential going forward?
I hope so. I mean, I think, to answer that question and to sort of piggyback on Jalen and Elliot's question from the previous, or answer from the previous question, during this COVID, we've learned a lot about ourselves as a society, as and as people. And I said earlier, kids are resilient, but a lot of times grown folk got to do better. We're their examples, and that incident at the Capitol, like, come on, man, like what are we doing? You know what I'm saying? Like, as Jalen said earlier, we have a democratic process, and you claim to be patriots. Like, that's not patriotic. And so all of this, COVID, the social unrest, the educational loss, I mean, all of this is impacting our children. We need to talk about it as we are. We need to learn from it. We can't deny it's happened. We got to be honest about it, but we have to recognize that there's an impact. And Elliot talked about mentorship. I mean, I know, obviously the great work that Jalen's doing in Detroit with his school, but I'm mindful of, Jalen and I, we came in as rookies together, and we go to our respective teams, and we got vets. I had Joe Dumars, I had Mark West, I had Johnny Dawkins. Like, I had guys that showed me what it takes to be able to play and survive and do things right in this league. And that was important for my development as an athlete, and being able to just, have success and endure throughout the course of my career. And then as, Jalen and I got older, we assumed that role. We became the vets. We became, as Elliot said, the mentors. And so, we just have to be mindful of that as we move forward. Understanding that if we want to impact our children in the midst of all this, we want to, sort of help them navigate what life has thrown at them unfairly. And we gotta step up. We gotta do better. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying necessarily us, but I'm just saying in general, grown folk got to step up and do better. And what I've seen is, what we've done over the course of the last year is not good. And but I still believe our kids are resilient. I believe that they'll get through this and ultimately be fine.
Jalen, any thoughts around this whole issue of, just those people who have become essential, who were always essential, but we've kind of decided that we need to call them that now, and this whole idea of grown folks doing better for our children?
Absolutely. And each of you made great points about adults setting the example. And there's a statement that always got used when I was growing up: do as I say, not as I do. And as I started to get older, I started to realize what that meant. Like, parents aren't perfect and don't necessarily judge me by the things I'm not doing perfect. But in order for you to eat, I have to work really hard. I have to be disciplined. There's certain decisions I have to make in order for me to be in position to take care of the family. And then that becomes a trickle-down effect for our young people as we're making great decisions as adults. But Elliot talked about mentorship. That's also extremely important, because time is really invaluable, and there's so many broken homes. And even a lot of times young people may live in homes that may seem stable from the outside looking in, but they don't necessarily feel like they want to go to their mom or their dad or their uncle or their brother about some challenges that they may be dealing with. So that's why having that outlet is always extremely important. And also for the young people, just stay encouraged. Like, it really takes a long time for your goals to happen. Like school happens, it's like elementary school, then it's middle school, then it's high school. And then before you know it, it's college. And you getting out of college, you're 21 years old. So it's like, that's a long time to sacrifice for your goal. And so make the decisions, be disciplined, and take care of one another. Treat others like you want to be treated, and continue to be inspired in spite of the fact that it seems, in particular, since each of us are Black on this panel, it's important for me to say this. We were taught that in a lot of cases that we may need to work twice as hard and get paid half as much. We were taught that, we need to get the please and thank you that we deserve. But we're trying to put the families in position to do better than the previous generation. So stay encouraged. You guys having me.
Hey, Terri, can I piggyback on what
Absolutely.
what Jalen said is, and I completely agree with you, Jalen. My grandfather used to say, "Grandson, finish the race," and essentially what he was saying was, see what the end is going to be. Sometimes our kids get discouraged in the middle of the race, and even adults get discouraged in the middle of the race. And oftentimes in that adversity, we decide to turn back. What he's saying is finish the race. You don't know what the race may be. You may win the race down, at the end. And there is a reason God allows us to look behind and not ahead. There is a reason that God allows us to look behind to see where we've come from, as opposed to look ahead. And I'll make this anecdote because I think it's important about the equity that our young kids bring to the table. If only we can encourage them, if only we can push them out of their comfort zones. I always tell this story is I grew up in North Memphis, and obviously my mom was 15 years old when she had me. And I always tell the story that my father died when I was a month after I was born. But I tell the story of how I learned how to swim going to public swimming pools. And the way I learned how to swim was my uncle just threw me in the swimming pool, and you flounder around a little bit, but ultimately you learn how to swim. Well, one day my uncle told me, "You're going off the diving board today." And I said, "No, I'm not going to be able to do that." And so, but he convinced me to go off the diving board, and you get in line at the public swimming pool, and there's a line that forms behind you because there's only one board. And one person went off the diving board, and he took his index finger, and he just nudged me in my back. And I took a step forward. The next person go off the diving board, he took his index finger, he nudged me. Long story short, my time came. I got on the diving board, I jumped off. I swam to the top, swam to the bank, and I got out. And the very first thing I did when I got out of the water was I went back and got in line. And I tell that story because my uncle didn't do anything special. Whatever I accomplished was already in me. And so what I'm saying is we just need to nudge our kids. We don't need to force them. We just need to nudge our kids, encourage them to get out of your comfort zone. Whatever success you're going to have, it's already in you. We just have to find a way to bring it out of them.
That's a really powerful point, Elliot, and I think a really good note for us to probably end on. One of the things I'd like to say is that each of you talked about how someone has poured into you to get you to where you are today. And that all of us have a responsibility to do the same and pour into our young people to help them get to be the best that they absolutely can be. And we should never sugarcoat and say to them, "Oh, everything's going to be just fine, everything's going to be perfect," because that's just not the way life is. There are ups, there are downs, there are twists, there are turns. But usually, you move along the path in an upward motion over time. There may be some ups and downs, but over the course of it, you're moving up. And I think that as long as young people have wonderful examples like each of you, and you are able to encourage them, they too will learn that they need to pour into someone else. I think when we all look back on 2020, and God knows what 2021 is going to bring to us, we will be better for everything that we have experienced in this year. We will have become more resilient. We will become more tenacious. We will become, in some ways, more social and more caring because of what we haven't been able to do. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us for this Intersection of Race and Sport panel. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. Thank you, and we look forward to you participating in future panels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Terri and the guys hit on a lot of relevant topics in that discussion. Elliot Perry stressed the importance of mentoring as January is National Mentoring Month. I like to stress the importance of National Mentoring Month as well, and I'd also like to direct our viewers to grizzliesfoundation.org. That's grizzliesfoundation.org for more information on how to become a mentor and transform a child's future. Now, before we get to our last conversation of the evening, let's head back to Royal Studios in South Memphis. It's Frayser Boy and Ashton Riker back by the High Rhythm section.
Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting till the eve comes, watching the ships roll in. I'll watch them roll away again. I'm sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away. Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. Ladies and gentlemen, Academy Award winning Frayser Boy.
Hey, I'm just sitting here chilling when I be in my feelings. I be on the mission, I'm just trying to make a living. All my homies either dead or in jail. Like heaven or hell, so they depend on me. I can't fail. Catch me in the bay where it ain't all good. Reminiscing on the times when I wished I could. I remember in the hood, yeah, I lost a lot of friends. Yeah, I still ride through to feel the memories again. I be feeling real blessed, that's why I keep it God first. Through all the hard work, I got just how God works, so it's the dock in the bay. Ain't no stopping my faith. My escape blowing strong, forget my problems today.
Sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away.
What we doing, Ashton?
Sitting on the dock of the bay.
What we doing?
Wasting time.
Come on, let you talk to him one time.
Well, it looks like not a single thing's gonna change. Everything still remains the same. Honey, I can't do what 10 people tell me to do. So I guess I'll remain the same. Oh, it's nothing more that I can say. From downtown all the way to the bay. And the blood is running through my veins. Oh, man, I'm Memphis. Sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away.
What we doing, Ashton?
Sitting on the dock of the bay.
What we doing?
Wasting time.
I'm gonna let you talk to him one time. Memphis Grizzlies.
Memphis, stand up.
There go.
Frayser Boy.
Ashton Riker.
All right.
M-Town.
We'd like to thank tonight's musical guests, and a special thanks and shout out to Royal Studios owner and legendary producer Boo Mitchell. Boo, thanks for opening up your studios for us this week and helping us celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in an authentically Memphis way. The previous panel touched on how COVID-19 has infected and impacted the students' ability to both learn and receive and not receive their lessons. Our final panel will be a deep dive into education, exploring educational inequities, and how COVID-19 has impacted scholars nationwide.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I am Courtney Cox, and this is our final panel discussion of the day to celebrate and honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Throughout the day, we have heard great insight from a range of people on what Dr. King's legacy has meant to them, to the activism of NBA players while in the bubble, culminating with where we are now. Social justice in education refers to the commitment to challenging social, cultural, and economic inequities imposed on individuals arising from differential distribution of power, resources, and privilege. 10 months in a pandemic, and we have seen our communities remain resilient. However, adjustments to this new normal are harder to get used to, specifically virtual learning. As normal as we have tried to make our lives by coping with the pandemic, virtual learning is something we are all trying to navigate, and it seems to change every single day. This community conversation will allow us to take a deeper dive into educational inequities and how COVID-19 is impacting the achievement gap. We will reflect on the historical context of education in America, how the digital divide is affecting students, and what we can be doing forward to overcome educational inequities. Allow me to introduce this wonderful panel. First up, we have Tristan Ficklin. He is an 8th grader in the Memphis Grizzlies Scholars Program at Grizzlies Prep. Tristan is a member of the debate team. He loves to read, play tennis, and enjoys playing games with his family. Tristan's dream is to one day attend Yale and to become a lawyer. Up next, we have Dr. Michael Lowe. Dr. Lowe has served in public education for over 24 years in Memphis. His teaching quest started in 1997, where he taught 5th grade mathematics and social studies at Ross Elementary. Throughout the years, he has worked his way up through the education system, including becoming an assistant principal, earning his doctorate in educational leadership, and serving as an adjunct professor at Christian Brothers University. Dr. Lowe is currently the equity officer of Shelby County Schools, and SCS is the largest school district in Tennessee. Up next, we have Marty Tippins Murphy, and she is the current executive director of Facing History and Ourselves. She has been with the organization since 1997, starting out of their Los Angeles office. A native Memphian, she moved back to her hometown in the summer of 2014 to work with the local chapter. Facing History and Ourselves uses lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. And last but not least, we have Daniel Warner. Daniel has been teaching U.S. history at East High School since 2013. He has trained through the Memphis Teacher Residency Program and continues to mentor young teachers through the program. He was also named Tennessee's 2019 James Madison Fellow. He is working toward an MA in Political Science at the University of Memphis. And this past year, he was the recipient of the 2020 Tennessee Council for the Social Studies 9 through 12 Grade Teacher of the Year, the 2020-2021 Shelby County Schools Teacher of the Year, and the 2020-2021 West Grand Division Tennessee Teacher of the Year. Wow, a lot of accomplishments on his list. I would first like to say thank you all so much for joining us. And in recognition of MLK Day, I'd like to share a quote by Dr. King. "We are not makers of history. We are made by history." With these sentiments in mind, education is known as the great equalizer, but the promise of equality can't be achieved when fundamental injustice exists within school systems. Brown versus Board of Education outlawed segregation nearly 70 years ago, and many districts, particularly those in urban areas, are effectively segregated. I would like to set the tone by highlighting two prominent events that helped shape the current educational climate: redlining and Brown versus the Board of Education. In the 1930s, redlining was introduced, which is a discriminatory practice. Local banks used it as a way to deny credit particular neighborhoods based mainly off of their race. The bigger impact of that was that students was first forced to attend schools that had been zoned to based off of their neighborhood where they lived in and their zip code. School funding for public schools is most commonly based on the property taxes from that community, which have significant variations depending on the wealth of the neighborhood and the surrounding community of each school. Ultimately, students in lower income neighborhoods saw less spending and suffered more from education inequities. In 1954, the unanimous Brown versus Board of Education decision declared school segregation unconstitutional. But many public school districts and schools remain segregated by race and socioeconomic status today. This first question is for Marty. Based on these historical events, do you think we are repeating history in our current education climate? And what are some educational inequities?
Hi, Courtney. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and I'm just so pleased to be here tonight. And, you know, as you said, Facing History uses the lessons of history to challenge teachers and students to challenge bigotry and hatred. And so I like to think of it not so much as history repeating itself, but that history is on a continuum. And when we think specifically about the education system, we know that race has been at the center of who gets educational access and resources. And so for Black and Brown students, that access has been equitable from the start. I mean, we can look back at even further in our history to the American Indian boarding schools, in which indigenous children were taken from their families and their cultures and their identities, and really in order to conform to a notion of this white European sense of identity and conformity and culture. And when we look after the Civil War and the push for education during the Reconstruction era, for African Americans, and in Memphis, in our own community, there were, schools that were established by the Freeman era, and then were burnt down during, the Memphis massacre of 1866. So that continuum has been going on for a long time, and it includes, both progress in terms of what Brown versus Board established, but then also these setbacks that we see throughout our history. I think it's important for us to recognize that we don't want to just blame the education system for societal issues that we have yet to address in terms of the kinds of inequities and culture that our country has in terms of white supremacy. But when you ask the question about what current educational inequities I see right now, I'll tell you the thing that keeps me up at night is I think about the role of education also in terms of educating for democracy. And when we look at our current events and the current state of the world, how important it is for all students, particularly Black and Brown students, to be able to fully participate, how important it is for them to learn how to be participants in a democracy and have their voices heard. And so that means they have to understand their history. They have to understand their rights. They have to have these opportunities to develop critical thinking and media literacy. And so that their perspectives are shared and that their voices are part of an equal access and participation in our democracy. And when it goes back to when you think about the progress that we made, we have examples throughout history, particularly in the civil rights movement, but not just during that period of time, where Black and Brown people and their white allies have had their voices heard and been able to be advocates for change. And so when it comes to those inequities that I worry about for students right now, I want to make sure that students in our community have those opportunities to really be full participants in our democracy.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for those insights. And as we continue with our conversation with the historical framework in mind, I want to shift gears just a little bit and discuss some current realities we are faced with. We know redlining practices have had lingering effects on communities as they shape resources available. And this question is for anybody. It's an open question. Based on this, do you believe students who belong to higher income communities have an unfair advantage over those from lower income communities? And do they still have an unfair advantage in a virtual space? So this is an open question.
Well, I would like to say from an educational standpoint, historically, better property always meant better schools. Even in the virtual space, we have to ask ourselves right now, are our students succeeding based on the fact that they have a parent at home an updated device and reliable Wi-Fi. Many times in this situation that we have, those that have the upper hand are those parents that can afford to stay at home or they work from home with their students. They're more apt to get their child up, get them online at 8 o'clock every day, making sure they're invested in every class. And those are usually the parents that can afford to do so. Many of our parents in the Memphis community, as you know, the living wage here and the work, the jobs that we have of stacking and packing in Memphis usually pay less than $12 an hour. So many of our students have parents that are essential workers and they have to get up and go to work. Or a lot of our students are taking care of siblings that are younger than them. So I will say that sometimes those are more affluent, especially in this virtual environment, may have the upper hand. But we do have schools and teachers, just like we have Mr. Warner here. I know he has office hours and he goes the extra mile. So it's all about sometimes the parent, the influence of the parent, but that's where the teacher comes in. A great teacher will mitigate all of those circumstances and will go beyond, above and beyond to help our students. So affluence does help make a difference, but again, the teacher that's in that classroom that takes the time and is evenly distributed across our city to help our students will help mitigate those circumstances.
Right. And you mentioned circumstances. No one could have possibly predicted that the COVID-19 pandemic would hit us as quickly and last so long as it has. And it has affected students and educators and even parents. I'm sure many of us here had to adapt quickly and experience significant changes right away. And today we are still learning how to adapt and making adjustments every day so we can be successful in a virtual space. And this question is for Dr. Lowe. You're in the hot seat again. In March, the pandemic stopped the world and caused swift adjustments. So how did SES pivot after learning about COVID-19, and what were some different adjustments to the start of the school year?
For Shelby County Schools, we took an approach of, first of all, our superintendent did make the call and let schools out right before spring break. Schools were out and we did not go back. We began to meet as central office and leaders across the school district to meet and start planning. Then we got from the government the COVID-19, or what we call the CARES Act funds. So we began to think about how can we use these funds, because this money's not going to last forever. So we began to plan, and most of the world, as you know, were placing bids on getting laptops and electronic devices, but also our superintendent did a yeoman's job getting out there and getting wireless hotspots for all of our children, because as you know, in Memphis, the digital divide, many people do not have access to Wi-Fi. So it doesn't do any good to give somebody a laptop if they don't have a hotspot. So we began to recalibrate and make sure all of our students had a device with a hotspot in hand, and also training. But we still have a long way to go. It's a different space. I'm sure Mr. Warner and other people can attest to. It's a different time in getting grades and collecting grades and keeping students engaged, because one thing COVID-19 has done is exacerbated the fact that if you weren't a great school or great teacher before the pandemic, it's harder to teach virtually from a laptop every day. So our students need to have the sense of belonging, and we as a school district have been giving out surveys to students and trying to stay in contact with them. But that's how we pivoted and recalibrated, and even looked at the health department and pushed back our start date in Memphis, because we are an urban city in a rural state. We are the largest district, and other districts are going, but we had to think about our disenfranchised population in Memphis.
Right. And you mentioned students. This question is for Tristan. As a student, how have you been adjusting and coping to virtual learning? And what are you hearing from your friends about their experience?
So the way I've been coping with it is just kind of talking to someone, like saying how my day is to like maybe my mom, siblings, just talking it out. And my friends also, they say it's pretty hard to be, because most of my friends don't really have siblings to talk to, and most of my friends most of my friends' parents are normally at work, so they say it's pretty hard to talk to different people since they can't. And but I'm lucky to have someone to talk to all the time, so just in case, that's my way of coping with it, just saying how my day was and just trying to get used to the virtual setting.
Okay, yeah. As a college student myself, I live in an apartment with one other person, and my roommate and I, after 6-7 hours on Zoom, we come out and we sit on the couch and we just talk about how our day has been. So sometimes it's just getting that face-to-face interaction that we really miss and that we really took for granted. So I completely understand. Sometimes just talking to a friend, a best friend, a friend of me, maybe, it's something really good about just having that interaction. So I definitely understand, Tristan. And this one is for Daniel. Being a teacher and being in this virtual space for so long, what has been your experience working with high school students to ensure that they are succeeding in the class as we continue to move forward in virtual space and eliminate the digital divide?
For me in the classroom, it's been a lot of checking back in emotionally with kids and just asking them about their day, like exactly what Tristan was just saying, and making sure that kids feel cared for, right? More than ever, we're seeing that teachers are not just content deliverers. They are people who are caring for the whole child. And so I think the pandemic has made that very clear. And it's one of the hardest things is not to be able to connect in the same level with our students as teachers in the virtual environment. But I think for me, it's still finding ways to name the excellent qualities they bring to class, to name the assets they bring, to name the things I enjoy about them and what they bring to the classroom community. And that's been a really excellent way of, supporting kids in the virtual environment. And then you asked about what would it look like to continue moving forward and eliminating the digital divide. And I think that first we have to ask, what is the digital divide? And the digital divide is essentially the difference in access to things like computers and internet and technology. And it's easier to assume that this would be a problem in rural areas, right? But at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember seeing local news stations report that 60% of homes and families in Orange Mound and Frayser didn't have reliable internet access, and as much as 80% in some pockets of South Memphis. And so this is actually a Memphis problem as well, just basic access. But I think the even bigger question is knowing how to navigate technology once it's been provided, right? Like Dr. Lowe referenced, the district through the CARES Act money has been able to provide hotspots and laptops, which has been outstanding. But I think there's a misunderstanding that a lot of older folks have about Gen Z, right? Anyone really, even millennials like me who are just older than Gen Z people, is that they're very tech savvy. I hear a lot of my colleagues say, well, the kids know how to use technology. And the reality is that they know how to use phones, but they don't know how to use laptops. They don't know about Microsoft Word and how to save files. And they certainly don't know really about email and how to email appropriately and professionally. And so I think that a big step that we have to take is finding ways to teach basic computer literacy and even typing in schools. As I was reflecting on this question, I thought, if we're going to take seriously college and career readiness for 2021, for our kids graduating now, they have to be computer literate. And so when I'm getting emails that are entirely typed in the subject line, or every Microsoft Word document is saved with the same name, like the kids just name it after themselves instead of the name of the document or the assignment, we're seeing this like computer illiteracy and tech illiteracy. And I think that we have to invest anew. And I really think we need keyboarding, typing, and computer literacy classes in our schools in line with our college and career readiness shifts.
Wow. Okay. So from a district standpoint, this question is for both Dr. Lowe and Daniel. From a district standpoint and the point of view of an educator in the classroom, what would you say are some ways the pandemic has increased ever-present achievement gaps?
When we're looking at COVID-19, it has exacerbated, I think, going into this year for our young people at home, away from the classroom, their sense of belonging. It has widened the gap between those that have help at home and those that do not. Having a sense of belonging, someone they can talk to at school, as Daniel mentioned earlier. Our children have to have someone to check in with them. The socio-emotional gap has been increased, especially for our Black and brown students. We have many students coming from various areas, and if you are Black in Memphis, as you know from the 2019 poverty study done by the University of Memphis, things have not really changed that much since Dr. King came here years ago in 1968. The economic outlook has been very bleak. So in that regard, the gaps have been furthered. Technology, I do believe, even for our teachers, some of them are teaching from the couch, some of them are teaching from their living room or at home, and that has extenuated the gap even more, because as we know, some of our high poverty areas, the research says they don't always get the most effective teachers. So again, you have some of our areas in town where our kids are struggling. They also have teachers that are brand new to the profession, and they need to increase and heighten their pedagogy, but it's kind of hard because they can't get into professional learning communities and talk about what to teach and how to teach it. It's hard to do that via computer. People need to have that face-to-face feedback. They need to have that observation. They need to have that coaching one-on-one from their peers. So even for our schools and for our teachers, there's been a difference, especially if you're new to the profession right now as a teacher, touching students in the classroom. That problem area has been augmented by the pandemic. So we really have to, whenever we get back, we're really going to have more face-to-face touching, let teachers sharpen each other so we can get their pedagogical skills up to par for our students. I think that's one of the major challenges that's been exacerbated by COVID-19, having that professional learning community within the school that is needed.
And did you want to add on to that, Daniel?
And building off that, when you study education reform in the 21st century, we see that there had been a movement even pre-pandemic to cut education costs. And the easiest way to do that, or the most effective way to do that, is to cut teacher pay or cut teachers entirely, to up classroom sizes. And I think what this clearly shows, this pandemic shows, is that you have to have excellent teachers in the classroom. You have to have as many as possible in a building. You have to have support staff, social workers, counselors, all kinds of different people make the school run and actually attend to the whole child. And so we have to see the way that education is not, as I stated earlier, content delivery on its own, but is much more about an engagement with a whole person. And for me, dealing with and being able to teach juniors in high school, it's much more about, boys becoming young men and girls becoming young women, and figuring out who they want to be in the world and how they want to use their gifts to bless their city and their community. And I also just want to say that the kids have a really hard time this year. Even harder than the teaching situation is being a student, sometimes in a small apartment or home. Sometimes my students, being 16 or 17, are taking care of their siblings, making sure they're fed, making sure they're in class and that they're not, messed up with whatever happened with the computer or playing around, and making sure they're staying focused. So my students have an unbelievable burden on them. And I think a lot of us teachers have been incredibly proud of the ways that students have showed that they're still willing to learn, even when environments are less than ideal. And I know that I'm personally really proud of the students who keep showing up day in and day out to learn. And the last thing I'd say about the so-called achievement gap is that we really have to identify the way that neighborhood-based factors and outside-of-school factors impact the achievement gap. I believe deeply in effective teaching and that the highest poverty schools need the most excellent teachers, because it really is a different thing than just communicating content. It really is a whole person, a whole child, a whole teacher engaging one another. But also we have to begin to recognize the way that other social factors impact student achievement in the classroom. It's not just a teacher. A lot of our policies are aimed at evaluating teachers and saying, oh, you must be the reason this child is not learning. But as a community, we have to recognize that when we invest in housing, when we invest in transportation, when we invest in food access, healthy food access, and when we invest in employment opportunities, we are investing in educational attainment and outcomes. Because as goes a neighborhood, so goes that school. And so I believe that we really have to attend to community-wide factors in addition to the school. We have to begin to root schools again as the foundational institution of a community. And I think when we start there, we can begin to actually change some of the educational outcomes. And the biggest factor that is often overlooked, that's so clear when you root schools and communities, is racial and economic segregation. We have, like I was mentioning the introduction of this discussion, that there is so much racial and economic segregation in this city that things haven't changed that much, as Dr. Lowe said, since Dr. King was here in 1968. And we have to begin to address that. I believe education policy that's serious will attend to racial and economic segregation and the outcomes that produces at the neighborhood and school level.
And you mentioned students. So as educators and parents have been monitoring how fatigue affects students in the classroom for years, and as well as the massive use of increased technology, with the pandemic causing students and teachers to work and learn in a virtual setting, virtual fatigue has become a concern that could negatively affect scholars and educators in many ways. And given that virtual fatigue is so new to so many people, there has been a growing discussion around the long-term effects of virtual fatigue. And this question is for Dr. Lowe. How do you see virtual fatigue affecting scholars and educators? And if you see any difference at all?
I see it as I visit classrooms, and I just left a high school last Friday. And as I visit virtually some of the administrators, as we're going to visit classrooms virtually, there's just so many things going on with some of our young people. As Daniel said earlier, I've seen young people trying to learn a Maya Angelou poetry, but one is, having to do work around the house. I saw a young person getting their hair braided, or someone's trying to study and listen in while their other sibling is right next door or right in the same room online with their teacher. So I think the virtual fatigue, a lot of our students are treading water right now. Unless you think about socioeconomically, do they even have the space set up in their house? Right now I have my lights, I have my desk, I have my window. Everybody they're not blessed with that opportunity. So I think sometimes the virtual fatigue, even now, I've been sitting here, every now and then I have to stand up and walk around my office. But for students to be online from 8 o'clock almost to 3 o'clock, it is a lot, and it's a lot to drain on the student's brain, because we are, by nature, kinesthetic people, kinesthetic beings. We like to get up. Everybody likes to get up and talk and socialize. In this virtual space, engagement is key. And some of our students, as I said earlier, if you have a school that may not be a great place to teach and learn, that maybe the teachers, they love being there, or the students may not like being there before the pandemic, you can imagine how it is now, especially if it's that neighborhood school, as you mentioned earlier, Courtney, that they were just relegated to going to. So even with redlining and other things that we have systemically, some of our students are not at a school of choice. Some of them are at a school of choice, but they still have to have that instruction and not have that drain of being in front of a computer screen where someone is talking to them all day long. I'm really say this, I bless all the teachers. I thank God for all the teachers that are out there that are putting the time in. I know Mr. Warner is one of them that plans, that intellectually plans their lesson to think about, is Mario gonna like this lesson? Is Susan gonna like this lesson today? Is Timmy gonna like this lesson today? And what I'm teaching today, is it gonna reach them? because I'm already teaching from a screen. So I have to think about, is this something that's going to capture them? Because for most of our students, once they check in, they can log on, but they don't have to stay on all day long. Some of them can log off and just leave if they want. They can come back in and participate, but an engaging teacher is going to have chat rooms and going to have them engage and raising hands and asking questions, working on a project together. So a lot of that fatigue is set in, and it's all based on what the student brings to the table, if they were treading water before, and also the teachers bringing in all they can to plan a lesson 5 days a week for those students to come and be prepared. And they set that table for those students to come in and really learn every single day. But if not, I know it becomes draining. And we have to think about, in this environment, school will never be the same. After this, whenever we return, vaccines, whatever, whenever we return, schooling, colleges, universities, education will never be the same. So we're going to have to try to get all that we can. But in this digital environment, many of our students have to make an adjustment. It's hard to take an online class. I've taken one before. It's hard for an adult. So I can imagine if a student doesn't have somebody that's helping them organize and plan every day to turn in their assignments, it can become a point where they're overwhelmed.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. And you mentioned being overwhelmed, and you mentioned just it's hard. As a college student, it is very difficult. You have to have that discipline. And building off of virtual fatigue in a typical school year, you know, we would think summer vacation as the summer slide, you know, where students tend to fall back a little and they get, you know, laxed in their academic progress. Now that we are in a virtual space, you know, studies are proving many students are logging into their devices, but they're not paying attention to teachers, as you mentioned, Dr. Lowe. And this question is for Marty. When considering these studies, do you think that there will be long-term negative impacts of virtual learning, especially within urban communities?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I think that it's something that we really have to be concerned about, particularly students, as has been discussed, who have really, tuned out, have not really been engaged in their learning because, as Dr. Lowe just said, they can log on, but then they can pretty much walk away. At Facing History, we've been involved with virtual learning since before the pandemic, and of course, with the pandemic, what it has done is brought greater awareness to the inequities that have already been here, that have existed, right? I mean, if people recognize that and recognize that we don't want to go back to the way it was. There's an opportunity here as well to revision education, and so I think that we really need to double down on those things that we know are so important for young people when it comes to having them engaged in their learning. One of the so as a professional development organization, that's what we have been doing since March, in terms of just with the pandemic, is shifting to be able to support teachers and students in online learning. So being able to give resources to support especially students' social and emotional needs. How do you create that sense of belonging and community, and to help students to continue to have those relationships with their teachers and their peers within this environment? So that's something that we talk to teachers about all the time, all day. And we're sentient beings. Somebody shared this quote with me the other day, and I'm not sure, they didn't say who said it, but it's it's not so much I think therefore I am, it's I feel therefore I think. And with Facing History, with our pedagogical approach, it's really for students to engage their intellect and that intellectual rigor, but it's also to engage their emotions, and then ethical reflection, and that's really how to get them making education relevant. One of the things that we've seen, since March, there's so many current events that have happened that students, they're not, just because maybe they're not showing up for class, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a switch that's turned off. They're still learning in the world and still seeing what's happening around them. And for some of them, maybe being exposed to things that they hadn't thought about for in terms of the world beyond their own community. And so we've seen that when they have those opportunities to talk about and process what they're feeling and what they're seeing, and really to help them think about those connections and what that means to them, that's an educational opportunity that I hope that some of the things that we can to continue to provide are those meaningful learning experiences when we do go back, when we're not in virtual pandemic world anymore. So we have learned so much, and there has been definitely things that have been such a challenge for our students, but they also, I hope that we think about not just the achievement gap, but the equity debt that we owe our students, which will be increasing. And so, we as adults and systems are the ones that are at risk of failing them if we don't really take seriously what education looks like moving forward.
Thank you so much for that, Marty. As we come to the end of our time together, I just have a few more questions for the entire panel before we close out. Recapping on some of what was shared here and knowing where we are now, what are some ways you believe we can disrupt educational disparities that have plagued schools in urban areas? And also, how can we as the community at large be more supportive to school districts, students, and educators? And this question is open to whoever feels compelled to speak first.
Well, I'll say for me, going into this, how can we dispel some of these things? I think we have to stop trying to hide who we are as a country, as Memphis. As you know, Dr. King came here many years ago, 1968, and he came here simply because those in leadership would not give those that needed the most help. They would not bend and give in to what the needs of those sanitation workers, the needs that they had. Dr. King did not have to come here, and he did not have to die here in Memphis, but it was because people fought back against what was right for those that were impoverished and disenfranchised, those black men that were garbage workers in Memphis. So we have to think about it. Time and place and context set him up to have to be assassinated here. It didn't have to be in Memphis, but you have to look at the reason why. And we have to think sometimes we are guilty in that fact. And the question is today, going forward, are we still guilty? Are we still fighting against those things that would help free and that would help liberate our children, those that are impoverished the most in this city? Are we setting up schools and classrooms and also bringing about economic development for those people who need it the most? Many of the businesses and things that are in our city, and we have the haves and the have-nots in this city, and that poverty report explains it. Things have to change. And with this pandemic, I know some great things are coming out from our students, but we have to go back. We can't get amnesia. One of our greatest superpowers as a country and sometimes as a city is we get amnesia. We forget what happened in the past. We cannot forget. We have to build upon it. We have to understand where we are and see how can we make this city better. But it starts with our students and actually getting the funding, getting the best things for our teachers in the classroom, and also understanding that just because somebody takes a test and at the end of the year it says that child did not pass that test, we assume that learning takes place between August and May. We assume that happens by a state test. And what I come to say, and I'll submit to you, is I still remember Nina Gaddy, my 10th grade biology teacher, telling me things. It may not have happened that year, but now I'm up in age now, I'm 45, and I can still remember some of the things my teacher said and some of the learning experience that they taught me. So we have to just basically break the paradigm of what we think growth is for students and achievement. Because right now, ACT scores are great, but I know GPA is even more highly correlated with college success, which means we have to look at who's failing in our classrooms, who's getting A's, what classes are they taking, how can we get more of our black students, how can we get more of our brown students to take advanced coursework, how can we get them to have a career of their choice. So that's what we really need to do. Stop having amnesia as a city, as a country. Don't forget what we've done in the past to people, to blacks, to brown people, but especially those. And look at it, Dr. King. Why did he come here? Why did he have to be killed here? And what can we do to stop fighting for justice for those who need help right now, today?
Thank you. And would anybody else like to add anything to that final question?
I'd love to jump in.
Mm-hmm.
I think thinking of Dr. King's legacy on this weekend, I think about a speech he gave in 1967 when he really decided to come out and speak against the war in Vietnam, which was a pretty radical break with the rest of his nonviolent work previously. And he decided to take his approach not just from domestic policy, to not just pertain to domestic policy, but to be also about international and foreign policy. And he's naming some of the things that he thinks are making the soul of America sick. And he names those things materialism, racism, and militarism, right? And he's saying that we have become a thing-oriented society. And he says that to really undergo this radical revolution of values, we have to become a person-oriented society, a society that cares about people. And I think that in a society that's so marked by self-interest, we have to become people who care about the good of others, the good of the most vulnerable, even when it doesn't benefit us. And that's hard. And that is part of the call that drew me here as a teacher. But I also believe that if we're going to have people, if we're going to attract really excellent people to be working with our most vulnerable, like teachers, educators in the classroom, we have to be able to compensate them well, to honor what they're doing. We have to be able to say, you're contributing more than just like assigning textbook questions. You are actually shaping the young people of our society. And I also think in going along with investment in education, we have to begin to see that to invest in early childhood education is to actually create a society that is more fiscally conservative in the long run, right? As we become more people-oriented, it actually makes more money sense too, ironically, because then you have people who are able to provide for themselves. You have people who have access to good jobs, who can provide for families, who can establish, stable home environments and healthy home environments for kids. And so there's a lot of research, especially from Raj Chetty at Harvard, about the way that investment in early childhood can impact, children's lifetime earnings by hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so oftentimes we're just so focused on getting what we can out of life and what's best for ourselves. And I think, though, that there's this interesting and ironic logic that when we invest in the most vulnerable, we actually make a society that's better for us all. And so I believe that is a key part of living out King's vision when it comes to education, is undergoing that radical revolution of values and investing ourselves in the most vulnerable. It's not, he said when he came to Memphis, it's not what happens to me if I stop to help these garbage workers, but what happens to the garbage worker if I don't stop to help them. And I believe that's the same kind of spirit we have to bring to education in Memphis.
Wow, thank you. And would anybody else like to add one more thing before I wrap up? Has everything been said? I feel like this has been a wild conversation. I feel like I came in knowing something and then I left knowing a whole lot more. So I really appreciate it. Anything else? No? Okay.
I would just want to chime in, and I think others have said it too, is just let's listen to our students. We've worked, including students from East High School, who have a lot of good ideas about, what they need and how we can be better moving forward. So I would just encourage us to always remember to do that.
Thank you. Tristan, would you like to add anything as a student, as the young people in the Zoom room, as I like to say?
Yeah, I agree pretty much. It's that we should just try to cooperate with each other, especially in this virtual time. Like, speak out with each other, talk, just try to understand the situation more than what shows on the camera, and just try to try to know what your student and your teacher is feeling, because the teacher plays a major part in the student's life. So if the teacher is not good, the student is not going to be good as well. So I think it's a cooperative effort to make sure that both of the student and the teacher are doing well, so they can both have a very successful interaction.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we are going to wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories and your experiences. Virtual learning and engagement affects everyone at all levels. While you have proven to push through, there is still a long way to go. Crisis, pandemics, and natural disasters often expose many inequities. The pandemic didn't force the achievement gap. It exposed areas that have been issues for many years. Yes, laptops and Wi-Fi are a quick fix for students in underserved communities. However, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are still at a greater disadvantage, even in a virtual space. As we honor the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we must remember that his expansive vision for equity and equality in America went far beyond desegregation alone. Rather, he challenges us to hold ourselves and our systems accountable for narrowing gaps, increasing access to community, empowering young people, and truly transforming public schools across America so every student can succeed. Thank you for joining our conversation today. Stay safe and mask up.
What a wealth of information and what a bright future our moderator, Courtney Cox, has. She did a remarkable job leading the discussion tonight. Well, as we close, we hope you were both educated and informed. And visit grizzlies.com/MLK for information on this week's Grizzlies MLK programming. And don't forget to tune into the 19th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Weekend game, presented by Ford and your Mid-South Ford dealers, on Monday, January 18th at 4 p.m. on Fox Sports Southeast. Good night, everyone.